So we already watched a video from an earlier lecture on dealing with Lexington and Concord, and obviously the British were going to respond in kind, as all empires do, to when there is a rebellion, an insurgency. One could even use the word acts of terrorism. Of course, right? I mean, when an individual actor commits violence against a state, that is called terrorism. If you have an act of violence against a state by another state, it's an act of war. Am I right or wrong on that? I don't know. Tell me your thoughts if you want to on that, but that's just something to contemplate. So, in any case, we see what turns into a war, and we are familiar often, of course, with the Declaration of Independence. But there were declarations before that, and here we have an important one. It was also Thomas Jefferson had some work on with this as well, called the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Arms. Okay, so what are they saying here in 1775, July 6th? I'll read it. At least these are some sections from it. If it was possible for men who exercised their reason to believe that the divine author, okay, we're talking about God, right, of our existence intended a part of the human race to hold an absolute property in and an unbounded power over others, marked out by his infinite goodness and wisdom as the objects of a legal domination never rightfully resistible, however severe and oppressive, the inhabitants of these colonies might at least require from the Parliament of Great Britain some evidence that this dreadful authority over them has been granted to that body. It's very wordy, right? But it's also a very powerful statement, saying, right, that where is the evidence that the rulers of Britain have a right over, have all power of the colonists here, okay, right? Our forefathers, inhabitants of the island of Great Britain, okay, left their native land to seek on these shores a residence for civil and religious freedom, at the expense of their blood, at the hazard of their fortunes, without the least charge to the country from which they removed, by unceasing labor and an unconquerable spirit, they effected settlements in the distant and hospitable wilds of America, then filled with numerous and warlike barbarians. Talking about the Native Americans, right? So here again, I'm talking about, you see me reintroduce the idea of America being a European project. And specifically, we're really talking about the writers of something like this are specifically talking about coming from Great Britain, as we talked about. We know earlier there was other Europeans there, but in a sense, you could argue that really the revolution is by expats, people coming from the British, from Great Britain, right? Okay, and that's what they're saying, and they're using the term warlike barbarians. This is a Roman language about the peoples that they were conquering, that were not in their sphere of civilization. Okay, so there it is. And then they said, let's go on. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed and not before. With a humble confidence in the mercies of the supreme and impartial judge and ruler of the universe, again we're talking about God, right? We most devoutly implore his divine goodness to protect us happily through the great conflict, to dispose our adversaries to reconciliation on reasonable terms, and thereby to relieve the empire from the calamities of civil war. So here, this is also an interesting comment. The revolution, right, really was a civil war. We don't really think about that as in that way. That's not usually like how we talk about it all the time, but it was. And very powerful language. Again, a little bit wordy, but in a sort of in a very articulate and poetic way. And also, we can imagine how the British were thinking about this. The British must have thought this to be the most arrogant, unappreciative, like an ungrateful brat to write such things. And of course, that is how they've felt about it. And again, I'm not actually sympathizing with that cause. I'm just reminding you to think about it. It's interesting to think about how this is from all sides. And no doubt the independence. Now, this is clearly a landowner class that sent this, but many of the settlers built homes for themselves out in the frontiers. And yes, there is this independent spirit that the colonists have that really sees themselves as able to completely take care of business without a necessity of this empire that wants to reassert itself on the people living there. Now, Samuel Johnson, I believe, a British philosopher, I think his direct quote is, "The loudest yelpers of liberty are the drivers of the Negroes." What he was basically saying, and you'll see that quote in the Defense of Slavery book we'll be reading later, it didn't go without irony even then on back in the British Isles to write something like this and still have slaves. So I just want to point out that kind of contradiction was seen even back then. Okay, but needless to say, the Declaration was made. Okay, and we had revolutionary agitators. Thomas Paine is an important one. I find him to be one of the most interesting out of the early important characters that are part of the revolution. I want you to keep in mind that I'm only going to be highlighting a few important characters. There were many of interest that I wish I could bring up, but I think it's better that we just focus on a few to give us a sense of things, especially ones that are really, really important, such as Thomas Paine. And of course, I always want to encourage you to further and further your research on these topics. But anyways, so we go to Common Sense. This book, it's short. I'm having you look at it a little bit. It's a very interesting read, and he makes some. First of all, what's the argument? He's arguing a complete break from Britain. And it really did influence the public quite a bit. It sold more than 100,000 copies. Obviously, the population was much more sparse, not as populated as now. And I think that what I find interesting about what he argues in Common Sense is usually the Bible was something used to justify the divine right of kings. And he completely turns this argument around. And keep in mind, he knows that his audience, remember we talked about the Great Awakening, it was in one of the documentary clips that we talked about. The American public at this time was genuinely religious. You could argue that most Americans had a Bible in their household. Certainly Christianity, Protestant Christianity in different forms had a huge influence on the day-to-day affairs of people. So he takes the Bible. This is an ideology, a language in which that the majority of the population can relate to and say, okay, so we're having a Bible discussion now. Tell us about the Bible, Thomas Paine. And he says, let's look in the Bible. Did God really want there to be a king? Well, there's a story in the Bible that when God picked the Jews to be have a covenant and to be a chosen people, The Jews asked in the Bible, in the biblical story in the Old Testament, to have a king like everybody else. And God basically, and I'm paraphrasing everything for you, says, no, you don't want that. And they said, well, we want a king, please, like everybody else. And so he makes the argument. God says, well, your good kings will be good and your bad kings will be bad, and that's what you're going to get stuck with. And the story of the Bible is that most of the kings are bad. And so what Thomas Paine then says is, he's basically arguing, this whole ridiculous idea of a king wasn't something that God wanted. It's what the Jews wanted. And after all, we already know that they, come on, we're Christians and they already rejected the Messiah. We're not a part of this world. This is actually not biblical, and that we should turn away from having a king, the original mistake that the Jews asked for, that God did not even intend. This is kind of essentially what he's arguing. So you can imagine that this really excited his readers, and then of course he peppered it with many things dealing with British history as well, okay? Which would require you to know something about that, and apparently many of the people reading his works would have understood, okay? What's even more interesting is that Thomas Paine actually didn't believe in the Bible, which shows you that political propagandists, once they know their audience, they can use language, texts, to basically manipulate a population into ideas that they believe in. I use the word manipulate, that's a little bit harsh. In this case, inspire could also be another word. Thomas Paine's legacy on religion was interesting. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt called him a filthy little atheist. And the interesting thing is that he was not an atheist. And his book, The Age of Reason, which where he actually says very harsh criticisms of the Bible, basically criticizes, the conquests where children are asked to be killed by God's chosen people to take over the land of Canaan. Those things are in the text, and he finds those appalling. And he talks about Revelation, how the world's full of different religions anyways. How could you know which one is really true? Islam, Christianity, Judaism. He argues like a modern secular thinker. But he writes this in response to criticize atheism because he believes in natural religion. He is a deist. This is Enlightenment philosophy, that there is a God, but God is not necessarily personal. So God is not personal. He doesn't listen to your prayers, for instance, or notice if you have a scratch on your face. So he finds that the natural world actually provides us with insight that God made things. But I'm not going to go into too much details on that. But here's an example of somebody who has a huge impact. He writes this, and he's also a complex person. And I also bring it up because there is a discussion, are all of these founders, what is their sense of religion? And this is where it's difficult, even as historians. If you read this book on common sense, you would assume that he was a basic Bible believer. But no. But he's very well versed in the Bible, and he's able to use it to help inspire his Americans to break from Great Britain and to feel justified intellectually and maybe even spiritually to do so. Okay, so that's all I have to say about that at this moment.